A soldier vanished in 1945. 15 years later, his journal was found. The year was 1960, and the fields outside the small French village of Saint-Avold were quiet again. The war was long over, the land had healed, and children played where tanks once crawled. But that summer, when a farmer took his spade to an old oak whose roots had pushed too far into his crops, the earth gave back something it had been keeping secret for 15 years. At first, he thought it was nothing more than a scrap of leather. The soil was damp, and the object was stiff, cracked, half-eaten by time. But as he pulled it free, he realized it wasn't just leather. It was a book, a journal. The cover was scuffed, its strap barely holding. Yet inside, the words were still there. Faded, but legible. And on the very last page, a sentence stopped him cold. "If anyone finds this, know that I was not alone." The handwriting ended abruptly, as if the pen had slipped from the soldier's hand mid-stroke. That discovery would reopen a case that had been buried just as deep as that journal: the disappearance of Private Daniel Mercer, an American soldier who had vanished without a trace in the spring of 1945. For his family back in Illinois, for his unit who had tried to forget him, and for the quiet villagers who had whispered rumors ever since this was the ghost returning. But to understand the weight of that single sentence, we need to go back to where it all began, before the war, before the forest, before the silence. Daniel Mercer was born in 1924 in Bloomington, Illinois. He wasn't remarkable in the way that newspapers like to celebrate hometown heroes. He wasn't the captain of the football team. He wasn't the top of his class. But he had something quieter about him, a persistence, a way of looking at the world that made people feel he was listening, even when he said nothing. His mother, Anna, said Daniel had an old soul. His father, Thomas, said he had too much imagination for his own good. As a boy, Daniel was known to wander off into the woods behind their house, sometimes for hours, sketching trees, collecting strange stones, and writing in small notebooks he carried everywhere. His sister Margaret remembered how he would sit by the window during thunderstorms, scribbling furiously as if trying to capture the storm in words. When the Great Depression tightened its grip, Daniel worked odd jobs with his father, hauling lumber, repairing fences, delivering coal. He wasn't the strongest, but he never complained. He was steady. He was the kind of boy you trusted to do what needed to be done, even if no one was watching. And when the war came, Daniel didn't rush to enlist. He wasn't first in line at the recruitment office like some of his friends. But after his 19th birthday, he knew the choice would come to him anyway. Draft or volunteer, either way, the war was pulling him in. He told his mother he wanted to serve on his own terms. "If I'm going to do this," he said, "I want it to be my decision." So, in 1943, Daniel Mercer put his name down. By the time he shipped out, the Mercer family had already endured more than they thought they could bear. Margaret remembered their mother clutching Daniel's photograph the night he left, whispering a prayer that he would come back whole. The trains pulled out of Bloomington Station, heavy with soldiers and heavy with silence. Families waving as though their arms could stretch across the ocean. Daniel's letters home started almost immediately. They weren't full of heroics. They weren't the kind of letters you'd print in the paper. Instead, they were intimate, almost fragile. He wrote about the food, coffee that tastes like ditch water, but it's warm. He wrote about his bunkmates, a farm boy from Kansas who snores like a tractor, a city kid from Brooklyn who never stops talking. He even wrote about the sounds at night, like the world is breathing, slow and heavy, even when the guns are quiet. The family clung to these words. Each letter became a lifeline. But there was one detail that slipped through, almost unnoticed at first. Daniel often mentioned his journal. "I write to you, but I also write to myself," he told Margaret in one letter. "The journal holds the things I can't quite say out loud. Maybe one day, I'll show it to you, or maybe it's just for me." No one could have known then that this journal would one day be the only voice left of him. Fast forward to early 1945, Daniel was stationed with his unit in Lorraine, near the French-German border. The war was winding down, at least in Europe. Hitler's regime was collapsing, and everyone knew the end was near. For many soldiers, this was the hardest part, the last mile of a marathon, when exhaustion mixes with hope, and the finish line feels almost unreal. Letters from Daniel during this time carried a strange tone. He was hopeful, yes, but also restless. He described long patrols through villages where life was trying to stitch itself back together, children staring at them with hollow eyes, fields still scarred by craters. He wrote about nights when the forest around camp seemed too quiet, as if holding its breath. In one letter to his mother, he said, "I can't shake the feeling that the ground itself remembers more than it lets on." To his sister, he wrote, "Sometimes, I think the silence is worse than the fighting." And in his journal, the one discovered 15 years later, he wrote something even darker. "There are paths in these woods that don't feel like they belong to us. I don't like walking them." The last confirmed sighting of Private Daniel Mercer came in late April, just weeks before Germany's surrender. His bunkmates said he left camp after dinner, saying he needed air. He wasn't carrying his rifle, just his jacket and the journal. He never came back. The army searched, of course, at least at first. Patrols combed the nearby woods. They asked villagers if they'd seen him. Some said no. Others claimed they saw a man in uniform walking toward the forest at dusk. One old woman swore she heard voices that night, 2 men speaking low in the trees. But there was no body, no equipment, no trace. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead. Unofficially, whispers spread. Maybe he deserted, maybe he was captured, maybe he fell into a river, lost in the dark. His name faded into the thousands, swallowed by the war. But his family never forgot. His mother kept his letters in a box by her bed. His father refused to let anyone plant corn in the back field where Daniel used to sit with his notebooks. His sister Margaret carried the last letter he sent in her purse, until the paper nearly tore apart. 15 years passed like this, silence, aching, unanswered questions. And then came the journal. When the farmer handed it over to local authorities in Saint-Avold, they were stunned. The cover bore the faint etching of a name, D. Mercer. The pages were stiff but intact. And inside were entries written in the careful, looping hand of an American soldier. The early pages matched Daniel's known letters, mentions of bunkmates, the food, and the weather. But as the entries moved closer to the date of his disappearance, the tone shifted. He wrote of being followed, of hearing whispers when no one was near, of finding strange marks carved into the trees. And then, the final entry. "If anyone finds this, know that I was not alone." No signature, no explanation. Just an abrupt stop, as though he'd been interrupted mid-thought. The discovery of that journal would shake both Daniel's surviving family and the villagers who had long whispered of the soldier who walked into the woods and never returned. It would force investigators, historians, and locals alike to revisit the question that had haunted them for a decade and a half. What really happened to Private Daniel Mercer in the spring of 1945? Because the journal didn't just reopen a case, it opened a door. Before the journal, before the mystery, before the silence of the woods, there was simply a young man staring at a world unraveling. For Daniel Mercer, the war did not arrive all at once. It crept in like a storm far away on the horizon, thunder rumbling faintly until the clouds were suddenly overhead. In 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, Daniel was only 15, too young to fight, but not too young to hear the whispers at the dinner table. His father, Thomas, read the newspaper every morning as if it were scripture, the headlines in bold type dragging the world closer to conflict. His mother, Anna, tried to keep things normal: biscuits on Sundays, church every week, but even she couldn't hide the tension that grew with each passing year. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked in December of 1941, Daniel was 17. He remembered the way the radio crackled that night. His family crowded around it in silence as President Roosevelt's voice filled the room. Margaret, only 13 then, started crying before the speech was even finished. Thomas said nothing, just stared at the floor. Daniel watched his father's jaw tighten and knew what it meant. America was at war, and soon every boy he knew would be swallowed by it. The world in those years felt like it was moving too fast, as though life had been placed on a conveyor belt and no one could step off. Posters lined the streets, urging young men to enlist. Parades sent off soldiers with brass bands and waving flags. The movies played reels of news footage before the main picture, grainy images of tanks rolling across Europe and bombers streaking through the sky. At first, Daniel thought he might stay. Some boys from Bloomington tried to hide in plain sight, working in the fields, taking factory jobs, hoping to be overlooked until the war ended. But Daniel had a stubborn streak. He hated the thought of being pushed into something against his will. Draft notices were catching up with boys his age, and he told his mother quietly one evening, "If I go, I want it to be because I chose, not because they told me." Anna wept, of course. She begged him to wait, to pray the war would end before his number came up. But Daniel only smiled a sad smile. "I can't sit here while everyone else is out there," he said. "And besides, maybe it won't be so bad." It was a lie, he told her to ease her fear. Deep down, he wasn't sure of anything. When Daniel enlisted in the spring of 1943, Bloomington turned out in the way small towns always do for their boys. The ladies from the church baked pies. His high school principal shook his hand firmly and said, "We'll be proud to have your name on the wall." His sister Margaret hugged him so tightly he nearly lost his breath, whispering, "Don't let the war take you." At the station, the air smelled of coal smoke and hot iron as trains screamed their arrival. Daniel stood among dozens of other young men, most of them laughing too loudly, trying to hide their nerves. Some had never left Illinois before. Some clutched letters from girls they swore would wait for them. Daniel had no sweetheart, only his journal tucked deep in his pack, already half filled with sketches and lines of thought. He waved to his family as the train pulled away. His father gave a stiff nod. His mother pressed a handkerchief to her face. Margaret ran along the platform until she couldn't keep up. Daniel pressed his hand to the glass until the town disappeared. Training camp was the great equalizer. Daniel quickly learned that the army didn't care if you were from the city or the farm, if you were book-smart or barely literate. It cared only if you could march, shoot, obey, and endure. He wrote in a letter home, "Mother, I thought I knew what tired meant, but I didn't. We rise before the sun, and by the time it sets, I feel like I've lived 100 lives in between. My boots never seem to dry, my shoulders ache from carrying the pack, and the drill sergeant has a voice that could crack glass. But I'm learning. I won't let you down." Daniel wasn't the fastest, nor the strongest, but he was steady. When others faltered, he picked them up. When a boy from Brooklyn nearly collapsed during a long march, Daniel carried his rifle as well as his own, quietly, without boasting. Those who served alongside him would later say he had a kind of patience that made the misery bearable. But at night, when the barracks went quiet, Daniel returned to his journal. He wrote about the endless drills, the ache of homesickness, and the strange way time seemed to blur. "Days are long," he scribbled, "but weeks disappear." By late 1944, Daniel was shipped overseas. His letters home grew more cautious. The censors cut out details, blacking over anything that might reveal location or strategy. What came through instead was tone sometimes weary, sometimes hopeful, sometimes strangely poetic. To Margaret, he wrote, "I saw a field yesterday, full of wildflowers, untouched by the war. For a moment, it felt like the world was normal again. But then I looked beyond it, and the trees were blackened, burned to skeletons. It's strange how beauty and ruin sit side by side here." To his father, he wrote more practically, "I'm doing my duty, and I hope you can be proud. I've learned to do things I never thought I could. I know how to march in the rain without complaint. I know how to shoot straight, and I know how to carry a man twice my size if I have to. These are skills I hope I'll never need once I come home, but I'll have them all the same." To his mother, he softened everything. "I'm eating well. The coffee is strong. I've made friends. You don't need to worry about me." But in the journal, the truth sometimes leaked through. "The silence here," he wrote one winter night, "is heavier than any noise. I sometimes think the earth itself remembers every shell that fell. The ground feels alive with memory." War changed him in ways letters could not fully show. His bunkmates noticed he was often the one staring into the dark long after others had fallen asleep. When they laughed about women or cursed the officers, Daniel would smile faintly but keep writing. One soldier from Kansas joked, "That book of yours is going to get you killed. One day you'll be too busy scribbling to duck." Daniel only shrugged. "Better to leave something behind," he said, "than nothing at all." Those words would prove prophetic. In early 1945, as the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, Daniel's unit was stationed near Lorraine, close to the border of Germany. The war was nearly over. Everyone knew it. But that didn't mean it was safe. In some ways, it was worse. Soldiers died from landmines, from patrols gone wrong, from snipers who hadn't gotten the news that the end was coming. The men grew restless. Some dreamed aloud of homecomings, of parades and kisses. Others drank too much, trying to numb the waiting. And Daniel wrote more than ever. One entry from March reads, "There are paths through these woods that feel older than the villages. I walk them sometimes, and it feels like stepping into another world. The trees are too tall, the shadows too deep. At night, I swear I hear voices, not German, not English, something else. I don't write this to frighten myself, but because it feels important to remember. His letters home never mentioned the unease. To his family, he sent only hope. In one of his last letters, he wrote to Margaret, "When this is over, I'll take you to the lake. We'll sit on the dock until the stars come out, and I'll tell you every story I can remember. Promise me you'll wait to hear them. Promise me you won't give up on me before then." Margaret kept that letter folded in her purse until it wore thin, as if carrying his promise close would anchor him to the world. But the war had other plans, and by April, Daniel Mercer would step into the woods outside Saint-Avold and never return. The war had called him, shaped him, hardened him, and carried him across the ocean. But it was those same woods, quiet, waiting, older than the war itself, that would swallow him whole. And in the silence that followed, only his words remained. The winter of 1944 into 45 was one of the coldest Europe had seen in decades. Soldiers joked that it wasn't the Germans that would kill them, but the frost. Frostbite gnawed at toes and fingers, rifles jammed in the cold. Even the air felt sharp enough to cut. But by the time the snow thawed and the mud returned, the tide of war had already shifted. Germany was collapsing. Whole towns surrendered without a fight. Soldiers who once feared death every hour now found themselves looking around in disbelief, wondering if they might actually survive after all. That was the mood when Daniel Mercer's unit was stationed near Saint-Avold, a village tucked close to the French-German border. It wasn't Paris, it wasn't Berlin, it was just farmland and woods, the kind of place where time seemed to pause even as history thundered around it. The men expected relief here, a reprieve. But instead, they found something else. The countryside was beautiful in a way that unsettled Daniel. The fields stretched wide, stitched with stone walls and crooked fences. The woods pressed close, dark and damp, older than memory. Villagers spoke little, most of them scarred by years of occupation. Some eyed the Americans with gratitude, others with suspicion. Children peeked from behind doorframes, too cautious to run up and beg for candy like in other towns. At night, the village slept in silence. No laughter, no singing, not even the bark of dogs, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the creak of shutters. Daniel wrote in his journal, "It is strange. We are told the war is nearly over, but it feels like something lingers here. The air is heavy, the men are restless. I walk the fields, and the earth feels like it remembers too much blood. Sometimes, I think the ground itself is listening." His comrades noticed it too, though most masked their unease with bravado. A soldier named Carter, a red-headed farm boy from Kansas, said the woods looked too alive. He joked that the trees were planning something. Another soldier, O'Hara from Brooklyn, claimed he woke one night to see a figure standing between the trees, not German, not American, but something else. He swore the figure vanished when he blinked. The others laughed him off, but Daniel didn't. Daniel had always been the listener, the one who absorbed rather than dismissed. He asked O'Hara what the figure looked like. "Tall," O'Hara said. "Too tall, like the trees themselves had stepped forward to watch me." Daniel didn't write that in his letters home. To his family, he described spring flowers pushing through the soil, birds returning to the branches. He wrote, "It feels like the world is trying to heal." But in his journal, the words told another story. There are marks on the trees, carved deep, old but fresh enough to see. Circles, crosses, lines that don't make sense. Some say they are just old hunting signs, but I don't think so. The men grew restless. They were so close to the war's end that they could taste it, yet they were forced to wait in this limbo. Command sent them on patrols through the forests, checking for straggling enemy units. More often than not, they found nothing, but the woods left them uneasy. One night, Daniel and Carter walked a patrol together. The moon was thin, the path barely visible. Carter hummed a tune under his breath to keep himself calm. Daniel listened, his hand brushing the worn leather of his journal in his pocket. "Ever think about what comes after?" Carter asked quietly. "After the war?" Daniel said. "Yeah, like, will we even know how to live normal again? I can't picture it. I keep thinking I'll wake up in 20 years and still feel like I'm marching." Daniel didn't answer at first. The woods pressed in, and the silence seemed too thick for small talk. Finally, he said, "Maybe the war doesn't end. Not really. Maybe it just changes shape." Carter frowned. You always say creepy stuff like that. Daniel smiled faintly but didn't explain. The village of Saint-Avold had its own stories. The older villagers spoke little to the soldiers, but when they did, their words carried weight. One man warned Daniel never to walk the forest alone at night. The trees, remember, he said, in a hoarse whisper. A woman told O'Hara that the woods were cursed, that men who wandered too far never came back. She crossed herself when she said it, as if the words themselves had power. Most of the soldiers laughed it off. Superstition, folklore. But Daniel listened. He wrote the warnings in his journal. He sketched the strange marks he saw on tree trunks. Circles with slashes through them, spirals that seemed to twist off the page. And with each entry, his tone grew more unsettled. The men talk of ghosts and curses. I tell myself it is nonsense, yet I cannot shake the feeling that we are being watched. At night, the silence feels thick. It presses against the tent walls. Sometimes, I think I hear footsteps outside, but when I look, there is nothing. Then came April. The war was in its final weeks. Hope hung in the air like the first warm breeze of spring. Letters from home spoke of anticipation, the parades being planned, the factories already dreaming of peace. Daniel's last letters home were bright, almost tender. He told his mother he dreamed of her apple pie. He told his father he couldn't wait to walk the back field again. He promised Margaret that when he returned, he'd read her every page of his journal. But the journal itself told another truth. His last entries were short, jagged, the handwriting uneven. Something follows me when I walk at dusk. I found another mark on a tree, fresh this time. Carter says I'm imagining it, but I know I'm not. And finally, the day before he vanished. I don't think I am meant to leave these woods. The army had no way of knowing it then, but these were the last words Daniel Mercer would write before stepping into the forest one final time. The men thought he was just going for air. No weapon, no gear, just his jacket and his journal. By dawn, he was gone. And Saint-Avold would never stop whispering about the American soldier who walked into the trees and never came back. April in Lorraine carried the kind of deceptive warmth that made soldiers lower their guard. The snow had melted. The ground was wet, but no longer frozen, the trees carrying the faintest promise of green. Birds returned to the skies. For a moment, it seemed the war might truly end, and life might stitch itself back together. But April was also a month of unease. The men of Daniel Mercer's unit were restless, pacing the edges of Saint-Avold like wolves too long caged. The Germans were falling back, their lines collapsing, yet no one could say for sure what dangers still lingered. Mines, stragglers, desperate men, unwilling to surrender. And then there were the whispers from the villagers, not of soldiers, but of something older in the woods, something that had always been there. Daniel had taken to writing more than usual. In the week leading up to his disappearance, his journal grew jagged, fragmented. Footsteps at night. Marks on trees, new ones, not old. Someone or something doesn't want us here. He did not send these words home. His letters to his mother remained gentle. His notes to Margaret carried promises. But in the journal, the truth spilled raw. On the evening of April 19th, the men gathered for a simple dinner. The cooks served thin stew, bread gone stale at the edges, and coffee that tasted of mud. The air in the mess tent was thick with cigarette smoke, soldiers' laughter masking exhaustion. Carter told a story about home, about his uncle's farm, and a bull that chased him through a field. O'Hara chimed in with jokes, as he always did. Daniel ate quietly. He pushed bread through his stew, but his eyes kept drifting toward the canvas flap of the tent, where the woods stretched beyond camp, dark and still. Carter noticed. "You're doing that thing again," he said, pointing with his spoon. "What thing?" Daniel asked. "Staring at the trees like they're about to walk over and shake your hand." The men laughed, but Daniel only smiled faintly and went back to eating. Later, as the others settled into their bunks, Daniel stood. He slipped on his jacket, tucked the small leather journal into his pocket, and murmured something to Carter. "Just need some air." It was the last thing anyone heard him say. A guard on duty later testified he saw Daniel walk past the perimeter shortly after dusk. No rifle, no pack, just his jacket and that journal. His gait was steady, not hurried, not hesitant. He didn't seem drunk, didn't seem lost. He simply walked toward the trees, as if answering a call no one else could hear. The guard called after him once, half-heartedly. But Daniel lifted a hand in acknowledgement, the way a man does when saying, "Don't worry, I'll be back." Only he never came back. By midnight, Carter noticed the empty bunk. He figured Daniel was still out walking. By 2 a.m., worry gnawed at him. By dawn, the unease spread. Soldiers searched the edges of camp, calling his name. No answer. The commanding officer ordered a search party. They combed the woods, rifles at the ready. They found nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of fabric, not even the impression of boots in the mud. It was as though Daniel had stepped into the trees and dissolved. The villagers were questioned. Most shook their heads. A few swore they saw a figure walking near the forest at dusk. One old woman insisted she heard 2 voices that night, not one. She told the soldiers in broken English, he was not alone. The Americans dismissed her. Fear, superstition, confusion. But those words lingered. Daniel's belongings were packed up. Letters from home, photographs, the half-finished pack of cigarettes he never touched, and his rifle, still leaning against the wall of his bunk. For soldiers, the absence of a weapon was telling. No one left their rifle behind unless they intended to return. It was the one constant, the one rule hammered into them since basic training. Your rifle is your life. So why would Daniel walk into the woods without it? The official report was brief. Private Daniel Mercer, missing in action, presumed dead. Cause, unknown. But among his bunkmates, the story twisted. Carter swore Daniel had been uneasy for weeks, speaking of footsteps and marks on trees. O'Hara said he once caught Daniel muttering under his breath as he wrote in his journal, as though answering someone no one else could see. Others claimed he had been acting strangely, though no one could agree on what that meant. Rumors sprouted: desertion, suicide, a secret rendezvous, capture by stragglers. And then there were darker whispers, the kind no one wanted to put into writing, the villagers' stories of the woods, the old woman's words. He was not alone. For the Mercer family back in Illinois, the telegram came like a hammer. Anna wept so violently Margaret thought she might break apart. Thomas read the words silently, jaw clenched, then folded the paper and placed it on the mantel, as though refusing to let it near the kitchen table where life still happened. Margaret wrote letter after letter, begging for details. She asked if his body had been found, if there had been any sign of him at all. Each reply was the same: no further information at this time. To the army, Daniel Mercer became one more name on a list. To his family, he became an ache that never healed. And yet, in Saint-Avold, the whispers didn't stop. Villagers swore strange things happened in those woods for years after. Hunters reported hearing footsteps behind them. Children said they saw a man in uniform standing between the trees. The Americans had gone home, the war was over, but the story of the missing soldier lingered like smoke. For 15 years his family waited, hoping for news, praying for answers, receiving nothing. Until the day a farmer's spade hit leather beneath the roots of an oak tree. The journal. And inside, that final line: "If anyone finds this, know that I was not alone." The first morning without Daniel felt wrong from the second the sun touched the tents. Everyone knew it. You could hear it in the way boots dragged against the frozen thawed ground, the way metal mess tins clinked without the usual banter. Someone was missing, and even though men had gone missing throughout the war, this felt different. It was not the crash of artillery and the scream of orders. It was a hole, a quiet, stubborn absence that swallowed sound. Carter woke with the question already burning his tongue. He threw off his blanket, glanced at the empty bunk beside him, and said to no one, "He ain't back." O'Hara rolled over, blinked, and grunted. He went to clear his head. He'll shuffle in, hair all damp from the dew, with one of those lines he likes to write. But by the time the coffee was rationed and the morning's orders read out, the bunks were still uneven, the air still wrong. The commanding officer, Captain Leland, read his clipboard in that clipped, practiced way of men who want procedure to be stronger than fear. "Private Mercer, not present," he said. "Who last saw him?" The guard from the night before stepped forward, eyes rimmed red from the cold and from whatever he'd told himself as the hours crawled past. "He walked out just after dusk, sir. Said he needed air." Leland stared hard at the man, then let his gaze sweep the others. "Any of you think to go after him?" Silence stretched. Then Carter's hand lifted halfway, guilty, unsure. "I figured he'd be back in a tick, sir." Leland nodded once, a movement that looked like it hurt. "All right, we will conduct a sweep. This is a search, not a march." We keep our heads, we keep formation, and we do not, I repeat, do not get cute with the woods. These are not your backyard groves. Mines, pits, any number of things that want you dead. Pair up, 5 yards apart. You see anything cloth, wood, a scuff in the mud you call it. The men moved with a focus that felt like penance. Carter ended up beside O'Hara, both of them running on a thin wire of dread. Each breath bloomed pale in the morning air, then disappeared, as if the forest took it back. They slid under the tree line, swallowed by a gray-green light that turned every trunk into a shadow. The ground was soft with thawing leaf rot. Their boots sank with tired squelches, each step releasing a smell of wet earth, old bark, something sour like trapped water. Carter cupped his hands and shouted, "Mercer!" His voice cracked. The sound went up and seemed to break against the branches, then come down thinner. Birds startled, flapping hard, then all at once silence again, the kind that makes you glance at your watch even though there is nothing to see there but time pretending to be helpful. They pushed deeper. 5 yards apart became 8. 8 became 10 when the brush thickened. The line stuttered like a bad radio, and then reformed when the ground opened up. O'Hara called Daniel's name too, but softer, as if embarrassed by how hungry the woods looked when a man raised his voice. They found nothing. No torn cuff on a thorn, no scuff of boot heel in the mud, no cigarette butt, though Daniel was the kind who would have carried his with him for the ritual of it, even if he never lit one. The woods gave them back only their own panic. By midday, Captain Leland called a halt. The men sagged where they stood, some leaning their shoulders to the trees like boys asking their mothers for a rest. The captain stood on a low rise and set his jaw as if he meant to bite through the problem by force. "We break for 20 minutes, he said. "Water, rations, then we adjust our grid and go again." Carter dropped to a squat. His hands shook as he tore a chunk of bread. "He said he was only taking air," he muttered, "mostly to the bread. Who needs air that takes all night?" O'Hara tried for lightness and failed. "Maybe he found a girl," he said, then flushed. The joke hung there, tasteless. He scrubbed a hand over his face. "I did not mean—" "Do not be stupid," Carter snapped. Then softer, "Sorry, I do not like the feel of this place. Oh." O'Hara followed his gaze. The trees bent together like huddled men. On one thick trunk, the bark had been carved. Not initials, not dates. A circle with a vertical slash through it. The cut was old and not. The edges were smoothed by weather, but dirt still clung in the grooves as if someone had traced it recently. O'Hara nudged Carter and pointed. "That what he was drawing in that little book?" Carter stared. The memory bubbled up. Daniel sitting on his bunk, the small leather journal balanced on his knee, sketching quiet and intent. Carter swallowed. "Yeah," he said. "Those." You could feel the search turn after that like a wind shift you only see in how the smoke leans. Men began spotting the marks everywhere once they knew to look. On a sapling near the creek. On a heavy beech older than any man alive. Symbols stacked like a language that only the bark could read. A private from Ohio said, "Hunting signs, I think." Another replied, "What hunter needs a language that complicated?" They looked for the logic of it. Marks leading to water, marks near thick cover, marks where game trails cut the larger path. But the pattern refused to click. It was like counting in a dream. The numbers always slid away just when you thought you had them lined up. By late afternoon, the line looped hard to avoid a low swale that stank of stagnant water. Leland raised a hand. The line stopped. "We will not cross that," he said. "We skirt it to the west, eyes open." Carter felt it then, like a cold hand pressed to the back of his neck, the sense that they were seen. He turned, slow, trying to catch motion at the edge of his vision. Something dark between trees. When he blinked, it was gone. "Do you see?" he began. "Do not," O'Hara said quickly. "Do not say it." They made camp at dusk, not because they were done but because the light was. No one wanted to get turned around in a forest that refused to admit its own ground. The men built a small fire that pretended at comfort. The captain posted double sentries. "No one wanders," he said. "You piss, you take a partner, you dream, you keep it to yourself until morning." Around the embers, the talk slid from practical to pleading. A medic, named Foster, told the story of a man in his old unit who wandered off during a snow squall and was found 3 days later under a drift, alive and warm as if the snow had wanted him. A radio man told the rumor of a German scout who set traps that were not traps Exactly, but places where sound bent, and you could no longer hear your own feet. No one was trying to scare anyone else. It did not matter. The woods had their own ears for stories. Carter lay on his back and watched branches write black letters across the sky. When sleep came, it came rough. He dreamed of Daniel sitting at the foot of his bunk with the journal open and a look on his face Carter had never seen in life. Not fear, exactly, not sadness, but attention. In the dream, Daniel listened for something no one else could hear. At first light, the search resumed. The line widened. A second team worked from the village outward, led by 2 French gendarmes who had lived in those trees their whole lives and still moved with caution. One gendarme, a man with a face like chopped wood, paused at the same carved symbol that had stopped O'Hara the day before. He touched it with 2 fingers, then made a small gesture at his chest, something halfway to a prayer. Carter asked, "Hunting sign?" The gendarme looked at him for a long time, then said in very careful English, "Non." He tapped the mark again. "Old, older than me, older than him." He jutted his chin at the beach's massive girth. "You do not follow where you do not know." They did anyway. They were soldiers, and soldiers go where orders point. They found a creek that was not on the maps, a trickle over stones that swelled after rain and then hid itself under roots. They found a low berm of earth like a forgotten trench. They found a clearing littered with shell casings no one in their unit had fired, and a rusting helmet half swallowed by moss. They found everything except the one thing they wanted. By the end of the second day, the captain's voice lost its iron. He gathered the men and told them what they already knew but could not say. "We will file the report," he said. "We will widen the search with sappers to test the ground. We will speak to the villagers again. We will not stop." But the way he rubbed the bridge of his nose said otherwise. Men do not turn the world inside out for a private who walked away from camp on the eve of victory. There were bridges to secure, roads to hold, surrender lines to receive. War is a machine that grinds without sentiment. The third day brought the chaplain. He moved through the trees with his collar turned up and his eyes set low. He stopped where the men had marked a small cluster of stones, not a grave, exactly, just a place where someone before them had wanted a center. He bowed his head, murmured words that were meant for Daniel if Daniel could hear them, and for the living if they could not. Carter stood apart, hands tight at his sides. O'Hara came to him, offered a cigarette. Carter took it and did not light it. He said, "What do we tell his people?" O'Hara stared at the ground. "That he was here, that he is not here now, that we tried." "Will you write it?" Carter asked. O'Hara nodded once. "We will both write. You to the sister, me too. Whoever reads a stranger's words when they come with a new hole in them." The formal letter, the one that would come on official paper, typed and detached, took longer. It had to pass through channels, be stripped of anything that might suggest negligence or mystery. It would say missing. It would say presumed. It would not say scared. It would not say the trees took him, because paper does not hold feelings that refuse to fit into lines. On the 4th day, 2 military police arrived from a larger command post west of the village. They carried a different kind of authority, the clean edge of men who are less interested in finding than in explaining. They interviewed the night guard. They asked if Daniel had appeared intoxicated, despondent, unbalanced. They asked Carter about the journal. "What did he write?" one of them said, pen poised. Carter shrugged, the motion a stubborn shield. "He wrote about home. He wrote about the way coffee tastes in the field. He wrote things." "Things?" "Lines, bits. I am not his secretary." They turned to O'Hara. "Was Private Mercer known to disappear on walks?" "He liked quiet," O'Hara said. "He did not like the pounding in his head after a day of men pulling at it. He went to breathe. He always came back." The MPs shared a glance that said the answer fit more than one form. "Any trouble with officers? Any discipline on record?" "No." "Any enemies in the unit? Fights? Gambling debts?" O'Hara laughed once, harsh. "What do you think he was? He was a man who stared out a tent flap and wrote things down so he would not drown inside his own skull. That is not a crime." They wrote it anyway, not as a crime but as a possible indicator. They wrote that he had retreated into writing. They wrote that he preferred solitude. They wrote that he walked alone at night. They did not write the marks on the trees. They did not write about the woman in the village who told them not to go. They did not write about the second voice someone thought they heard, because a report cannot carry a thing like that. It shakes loose on the way and falls into the wastebasket. Word reached the village that the Americans were looking for one of their own. Doors opened cautiously. The baker said he saw a man in uniform heading east at dusk. He was sure until he was asked to be sure, and then he was less sure. A boy said he watched a soldier kneel by the creek and wash his hands for a long time. A widow with pale eyes said she heard footsteps on her lane after dark, not one pair but two, not in step but close, like how a hunter shadows a deer. The MPs thanked them all and believed almost none of it. They wanted crisp edges. They wanted a body, a note, a confession from the soldier's own mouth via his friends. All they had were stories and a forest that kept its own counsel. On the fifth day, Captain Leland stood before his men, with the look that says a choice has been made somewhere above his rank. "We are scaling back the search," he said. "We have our assignments, and we will carry them out. The sappers will continue to sweep likely areas for hazards. If anything is found, we will know. Until then, we pray, and we carry on." Carter felt the words land like stones in his chest. He lifted a hand. "Sir, with respect, he is out there." Leland's eyes softened, just for a breath. "Private, I have led enough searches to know when we are hunting an answer, not a man. If Mercer walked away and kept walking, he may be beyond our line. If he fell in a hole, he is beyond our reach. If something else happened, we will not solve it by trampling every inch of Lorraine. I will not lose another man to a mystery." The men dispersed in a mutter of anger that had no place to go. O'Hara lingered until the captain turned to him, voice low. "You were close to him," Leland said. "As close as anyone," O'Hara said. "He kept most of himself tucked in that book. Do you think he ran? No. Do you think he meant to die? No. What do you think, then?" O'Hara looked at the trees lining the far edge of camp. He chose his words like stones placed across a stream. "I think there are places a man can stand where he is himself 1 minute, and then the next minute he is part of the place instead. And no one can tell you how it happened." Leland studied him, then nodded as if he wished the army issued an order for that kind of thing. "See to the men," he said. "They are watching how you carry this." That night, Carter finally wrote to Margaret. "Miss Mercer," he began, and then he stared at the page as if it would tell him what to say. He started again. "Margaret," he tried, and that felt like a trespass and also the only honest way to do it. He told her about Daniel's quiet. He told her how her brother could make a tent feel calm just by sitting in it. He wrote about the last letter Daniel had shown him, the one where he promised to take her to the lake and talk stars into the water. Carter did not write about the marks in the trees, because it felt like telling her a secret he had learned in a language he did not understand. He did write that he believed Daniel had not been alone when he stepped into the woods, not because of the old woman's story, but because Carter felt it in his bones, the way he felt weather. He signed it with his full name and a shaky note. "If there is news, I will write again first," and he folded the paper as if softness could make it less sharp when it arrived. The official telegram reached the Mercer house first. It always did. A uniform climbed the steps. The knock carried through the kitchen like a gunshot that took its time arriving. Anna was drying a plate. Her hands were suddenly wet again. Thomas answered the door, took the envelope, and swallowed the words like, "Bad medicine." He read aloud because that is what you do when you do not want a thing to be shaped by your own voice. "Missing in action. Presumed. Investigation ongoing." He placed the paper on the mantel and did not look at it again for 3 days. The town did what towns do. Some brought casseroles that no one ate. Some gripped Thomas's hand long and hard and said how proud they were. Some avoided Margaret on the street because her face was a mirror they did not want to look into. The pastor came with verses that meant well and landed like feathers on a storm. In the evenings, Anna took out Daniel's letters and read them straight through as if they formed a bridge. When she reached the last one, she would sit very still and listen, as if listening could call footsteps up the path. Back in Lorraine, the military police filed their report. They could not leave it blank. A blank is an admission. A blank says you know that the world does things you cannot name. So the report said, Private Daniel Mercer left camp after evening meal on or about the 19th of April, a year 45. Private was unarmed. Private did not return. Search conducted. No evidence of foul play. Evidence suggests voluntary absence. Desertion not ruled out. The paper did what paper does. Turned ink into something you can stack and store and pretend is the truth. Captain Leland sent a separate note up the line. It was brief and careful. He wrote that Private Mercer was a steady soldier with no prior incidents. He wrote that the area was uneven, mined in parts, and that a fall or explosion could not be ruled out. He did not write about the marks, or the way the men had begun to look at the tree line with their mouths slightly open, like people who had stepped into a cathedral they did not know they believed in. O'Hara tried to sleep and failed. On the 7th night after Daniel vanished, he got up and stood outside his tent and let the moon pour over him like a scolding. He almost walked to the trees. He could feel the pull, a thin wire connected to whatever space had opened and swallowed his friend. He did not go. He stood there until the cold hurt his teeth, and then he went back inside and wrote his own sort of prayer in the dark. Come back, or let us find the part of you that will hold still long enough to say goodbye. The next morning, the unit received orders to move. Not far, just enough to admit that time marches. They struck camp with the tidy speed of men who have taken down everything they loved because someone said it was time. Carter folded Daniel's blanket slow and then refolded it because he had not gotten the corners square. He slid the folded rectangle into the supply truck and felt like he had broken a promise. Before they rolled out, Leland gave the men a few minutes. Carter walked to the edge of the wood. He did not step in. He simply said, "Danny," like he was calling a dog home after a storm. The trees did not answer. But there was a sound, not quite wind, not quite birds, a susurration, the sound of pages turning somewhere you cannot see. Carter closed his eyes and imagined Daniel seated under one of those monstrous beeches, his back against the bark, journal open, head cocked as he listened. He imagined him writing the last line they had not yet read, the one that would be dredged up 15 years later, as if time were a pond you could cast for secrets in, and he imagined the way the pen must have stopped. On the road out, the trucks rattled past the village. The widow, with the pale eyes, stood in her doorway and touched 2 fingers to her brow in a greeting that looked like pity. The baker lifted a hand, flour dust flowering off his palm. The boy who claimed he had seen a soldier at the creek ran alongside for a dozen paces and shouted something in French that Carter could not catch over the engine. O'Hara waved anyway and felt like he had waved at a story instead of a child. They drove until the trees thinned and then broke. The fields opened like exhalations. The sky widened. The forest behind them kept its secrets. In the weeks that followed, the war cracked open for good. Surrenders rolled in like low waves, and then crest after crest, until men stood on roads with their mouths open because there was no more noise to fill them. The world pivoted to peace with the determination of a body trying to heal. There were ceremonies and cigarettes and photographs that would be pasted into albums and looked at with grandchildren on laps. There were names read aloud in churches, names carved into stone, names that made the air in a room go still for a breath. Daniel's was one of the names that did not get a grave. His was a story that folded back on itself every time someone touched it. The search had been earnest and early. The investigation had been brisk and bland. The family had been brave because what choice is there? But the woods had not finished speaking. They had simply gone quiet in the way that hills go quiet in winter, not empty, only waiting. And somewhere under an oak whose roots drank deep from a soil layered with older wars than anyone could name, a leather book rested. Its strap had frayed, and its edges had gone soft. The words inside had leached a little into the paper, becoming part of the page the way grief becomes part of a life. The last line slept like a seed. If anyone finds this, know that I was not alone. The search was over. For now, the panic cooled into a long ache. The official file closed with a click that sounded, to Carter, like the lid of a coffin nailed shut with care. But the first search had done something even its failures could not erase. It had drawn a map in the men's hearts of where the questions lived. Years later, when letters arrived and rumors fluttered and a farmer's spade struck leather, that map would flare. It would show them exactly how to feel the dread, the relief, the hope that scares like a knife. For the time being, the unit drove on, the wheels through mud, the men watched the horizon, the woods watched their backs. And in the Mercer house 2 oceans away, a mother sat with her son's letters stacked like a small, holy thing. She smoothed a page with her thumb the way a person calms a frightened horse and whispered, "Come home," to the quiet. The quiet did not answer. Not then. It would, someday, but not in the language any of them expected. The war ended, but the questions didn't. In the days after Daniel's disappearance, men still spoke of him in hushed tones around the campfires. When the unit finally moved on, They carried their rifles, their gear, and their unspoken guilt. But they also carried the story, and stories are heavier than packs. At first, the official explanation was simple. He'd wandered into the woods, likely struck a mine or been taken by stragglers. It was easy enough to write, neat, contained. But soldiers are not paper, and among themselves, their imaginations ran loose. Some whispered desertion. He was quiet, one man muttered. Too quiet. Maybe he had enough. Others swore they saw him walking with someone that night, not German, not American, but taller, thinner, strange. The locals added fuel. Villagers had lived with those woods longer than the Americans had lived with their rifles. They knew their moods, their dangers. An old farmer insisted he saw two figures vanish into the trees that night. The widow with the pale eyes said she heard voices outside her window, one man, and something that was not a man. A boy swore he saw a soldier kneeling at the creek, washing his hands until they bled. For every soldier who dismissed these stories, another soldier listened and felt a shiver crawl up his spine. Soon, Daniel Mercer was no longer just missing. He was a ghost in the making. When the war ended, the soldiers went home. Some buried the memory, telling themselves it was just another casualty among thousands, but others carried it in their pockets like a stone. Carter was one of them. He returned to Kansas, married, raised children, plowed fields. But every spring, when the frost broke and the woods near his farm thickened, he felt it again, that cold hand on his neck, the sense that someone was walking just behind him. He told no one, not even his wife. But at night, when he dreamed, it was always the same. Daniel, standing just at the edge of the trees, notebook in hand, mouth moving silently as though repeating words Carter could never hear. Back in Illinois, the Mercer family endured the slow, suffocating ache of absence. Anna never stopped setting a place at the table. Thomas grew harder with each passing year, silent at church, jaw set as though clenched against the whole town. Margaret carried her brother's last letter folded so tightly in her purse that the edges wore down. She stopped talking about him after a while, because every time she did, people tilted their heads with pity. She hated pity. But in the privacy of her room, she whispered his name like a prayer. And in France, villagers continued to tell the story of the American who walked into the woods and never returned. Children dared each other to follow his path. Hunters muttered they felt watched. Symbols appeared freshly cut into tree trunks, though no one claimed them. Time passed. The war slipped into textbooks. Men who had fought aged into grandfathers. But Daniel Mercer remained frozen, not alive, not dead, not home, not buried. He was a question. And questions don't die. By 1960, the war was history. Europe had rebuilt itself, scars stitched into cobblestone and soil, but life moved forward. In Saint-Avold, the war was no longer a daily shadow, but a quiet echo. Farmers tilled fields again, children played in streets that once rattled with tanks, and the woods, those same woods that had swallowed Daniel Mercer 15 years earlier, grew thick with green once more. Henri Levine was not a man who thought much about ghosts. He was practical, rooted like the fields he worked. At 52 years old, his back was bent from decades of labor, his hands hardened by soil and Sunday. He had lived through occupation, watched German soldiers march down his lane, and watched them vanish again when the war turned. He had buried neighbors, rebuilt barns, and endured more winters than he cared to count. But he had also heard the stories. Everyone in Saint-Avold had. The American soldier who disappeared in the spring of '45, the voices in the woods, the symbols carved into the trees. The widow with the pale eyes still muttered about it when she passed in the market. Children still dared each other to walk the paths Daniel Mercer had taken. Henri had grown tired of the tales, dismissing them as village superstition, the kind of folklore people cling to when history becomes too heavy. That summer morning, Henri was more concerned with the oak tree at the edge of his field. Its roots had pushed deep into his crops, stealing water, stealing life. He'd cursed the tree all season. Now, spade in hand, sweat already forming on his brow, he set about cutting the roots back. The first strike rang hollow, not the clean crunch of wood, not the dull thud of stone, something else. Henri frowned, struck again. The spade scraped. He knelt, pushing aside dirt with his calloused hands. His fingers closed around something soft, leathery, stiff with age. He pulled. The earth resisted, then released. What he held was no stone, no root. It was a book. A journal. At first, Henri thought it must have been lost by a villager. But as he brushed mud away, he saw the strap, the stitching, the English words faintly pressed into the leather. Inside, the pages clung together, but when he pried one open, he saw lines of handwriting. Careful, looping, distinctly foreign. And on the inside cover, faded but legible, was a name. D. Mercer. Henri's stomach tightened. He knew that name. Everyone did. He carried the journal into the village, dirt still clinging to its pages. A small crowd gathered, neighbors, curious children, the widow with the pale eyes who crossed herself the moment she saw it. They whispered. Some leaned closer, craning to see the words. Others backed away as though the leather itself carried a curse. "Give it to the mayor," someone urged. Henri did, and within days, the journal was passed to the local gendarmerie. From there, it made its way to American officials, still present in Europe. And finally, after months of processing, verifying, and stamping, it was sent across the Atlantic. Back to Illinois. The package arrived in the summer heat, sealed in brown paper and twine. It was addressed not to Daniel but to the Mercer family. Anna's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter from the U.S. Army, stamped and formal. It explained that a journal had been discovered near Saint-Avold, believed to belong to Private Daniel Mercer. It was being returned to the family as a matter of closure. Closure, the word already stung. Beneath the letter was the journal itself. Anna lifted it gently, as though afraid it might crumble. The leather was cracked, the strap barely holding, the edges stained with soil. She pressed it to her chest before she even opened it, tears already running down her face. Thomas sat stiffly in his chair, refusing to touch it. His silence was its own kind of grief, hard, unyielding. Margaret reached out, her fingers brushing the cover. She was 30 now, but in that moment, she felt like the girl who had waved goodbye to her brother at the station. They opened it together. The first pages were familiar, Daniel's handwriting, neat and steady, filled with the kind of details he'd always written about, the weather, the landscape, the quirks of his bunkmates. He sketched trees, rivers, even a crude map of the village. Margaret smiled through tears. "It's him. It's really him." They turned the pages slowly, afraid to rush, afraid to miss anything. But as the journal moved forward, the tone shifted. The entries grew shorter, more jagged. His words carried unease. Footsteps in the woods at night. Strange carvings on the trees. "Sometimes, I think we are not alone here." Anna pressed a hand to her mouth. Thomas's jaw clenched tighter. Margaret whispered each line aloud, her voice trembling. And then they reached the final entry. "If anyone finds this, know that I was not alone." The ink ended abruptly, as though the pen had been ripped from his hand. The room went silent. Anna wept openly now, clutching the journal like a relic. Thomas stood and walked out to the porch, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. Margaret sat frozen, staring at the words until they blurred. For 15 years, they had lived with nothing. No body, no answers, just silence. Now, they had his voice again, but it spoke only mystery. Word spread quickly in Bloomington. The Mercers had received Daniel's journal. Neighbors came by, some offering sympathy, some asking to see it for themselves. The local newspaper ran a story, calling it "A Message from Beyond the Grave." Some townsfolk whispered that the journal confirmed what they'd long feared, that Daniel had deserted, wandered into the woods, perhaps with someone else. Others argued it proved foul play. A few even suggested something stranger, pointing to the villagers' old stories. Margaret hated all of it. To her, the journal wasn't for gossip or speculation. It was her brother's voice, carried across time. She began reading it aloud at night, as though speaking the words could bring him back, if only for a moment. But every time she reached the final entry, she stopped. She couldn't say it out loud. I was not alone. The words tasted too heavy, too final, too wrong. In Saint-Avold, the discovery reignited the whispers. Villagers nodded knowingly. Of course, they said. The American was taken by the woods. His journal only proves it. Children dared each other to find more journals. Hunters swore the trees bore fresh carvings, as though the forest itself were still writing. The widow with the pale eyes simply shook her head. I told them, she said. I told them he was not alone. For the Mercer family, the journal was both a gift and a curse. It was proof Daniel had lived, thought, felt, and written until the very end. but it also dragged the mystery back into the light. Anna began keeping the journal by her bed, reading passages before she slept. Thomas refused to speak of it. He grew quieter, retreating into himself. Margaret carried the memory of those words, "I was not alone," like a stone in her chest. The journal answered nothing. Instead, it deepened the wound. Because the question was no longer what happened to Daniel Mercer. It was who or what was with him when it did. The discovery of the journal made headlines. Newspapers in Illinois ran the story of the soldier lost in France whose words had finally come home. Some called it a miracle. Others called it a mystery. For the Mercers, it was both. The U.S. Army reopened its file on Daniel Mercer, though not for long. They reviewed the journal. They interviewed surviving members of his unit. They revisited the testimony of the villagers. And in the end, they came to the same conclusion they had before: unresolved. But to the villagers of Saint-Avold, the journal confirmed what they had always believed. The soldier had not died alone. Theories spread. Some said Daniel had been taken by enemy stragglers. Some said deserters, bandits, even cultists hiding in the woods. Others leaned into folklore that the woods themselves had taken him, that the symbols carved into the trees marked places where the forest claimed men. For historians, the case became a curiosity. For the Mercer family, it was a wound reopened. Margaret read the journal again and again, searching for meaning between the lines. She underlined the final entry in pencil: "I was not alone." Sometimes, late at night, she swore she could hear her brother's voice in her head, whispering those same words. Anna kept the journal by her bed until she died. Thomas never spoke of it again. He seemed to grow smaller each year, as though silence was eating him from the inside. And Margaret carried the story. She told it to her children, to her grandchildren. She told it not as history, but as a warning. There are places in this world where men can vanish without a trace, and sometimes what they leave behind is worse than nothing at all. Even now, in Saint-Avold, the woods still whisper. Hunters say they feel watched. Children dare each other to follow the old paths. And sometimes, visitors claim they see a man in uniform standing between the trees, a journal in his hands, staring as though waiting to be heard. The Mercer family never got their closure. Instead, they got Daniel's final words, words that feel less like an ending and more like a haunting. "If anyone finds this, know that I was not alone." And no one has ever been able to answer the question, who or what was with him that night.